Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for those kind words. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I'm only sorry that I have to speak in English and not in Portuguese. Sorry about that. And since I've been mentioned as the Astronomer Royal, I must start with a disclaimer. People think I'm an astrologer, and I'm sometimes asked, do I do the Queen's horoscopes? And I respond that I've never been asked. I'm just an astronomer. I've got no crystal ball. And scientists' predictions don't have a very good record. You've all heard about scientists failing to predict computers or nuclear energy and things like that. All I would say is that they are not such as bad predictors as economists. They're the really bad predictors. Well, astronomers do make forecasts, and I'm going to make some forecasts about the coming decades. But mindful of the precedents of earlier scientists, I'm going to be very tentative. Astronomers think in terms of billions of years. The Earth existed for 45 million centuries, humans for a few thousand centuries. But this century is special. It's the first when one species, ours, has the planet's future in its hands, through our heavy collective footprint and through our use of more technology or our misuse of powerful technology. And that's really my theme today. 14 years ago, I wrote a book on this theme, which I entitled Our Final Century, with a question mark at the end. The publishers cut out the question mark, and the American publishers changed the title to be Our Final Hour. Americans like instant gratification and the reverse. Well, in that book, I didn't think we'd actually wipe ourselves out this century, but I did think we'd have a bumpy ride. And even without a crystal ball, there are some forecasts we can make with fair confidence. For instance, the world will get more crowded. 50 years ago, world population was about 3 billion. It's now 7.4 billion, and it's expected to reach 9 billion by 2050. The birth rate in most countries has actually leveled off, but the rise is continuing because most people in the developing world are young, they're yet to have children, and they will live longer. And the main population growth is in East Asia, and it's there that the world's human and financial resources will become concentrated. Of course, we're seeing the end of 400 years of North Atlantic dominance. And another change. In 2050, 70% of people will live in cities. Even by 2030, Lagos, Sao Paulo, and Delhi will have populations of more than 30 million each. And to prevent these megacities becoming turbulent dystopias will surely be a major challenge for governments. Population growth seems currently under-discussed, almost a taboo subject, maybe because it's tainted with association with eugenics in the 1920s and 30s, with Indian policies under Indira Gandhi, and with the more recent China policy of the one child, which has been very effective. And in the 1970s, forecasts by the Club of Rome and others that there'd be mass starvation have proved off the mark. Up till now, food production has more than kept pace with population. Famines still occur, but they stem from wars or maldistribution, not overall shortage. And indeed, most experts claim that 9 billion can be fed by mid-century. The buzzword is sustainable intensification. Farming that's low-till, water-conserving, using GM techniques, plus better engineering. But I think there will need to be lifestyle changes. The world couldn't sustain even half its present population if everyone lived like present-day Americans, each using as much energy and eating as much beef. To quote Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Population trends beyond 2050 are harder to predict because they depend on choices made of family size by people not yet born. If families in Africa become small, then world population will stabilize. But if families in Africa remain large by choice, then according to the UN, that continent's population could double again by 2100, from 2 billion to 4 billion. And Nigeria alone will then have as big a population as Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists remind us that each extra mouth brings also 2 hands and a brain. But if there's real economic growth in Asia and Africa, each individual puts more pressure on environment and resources. Indeed, there is a risk of triggering ecological shocks which degrade the land and the biosphere. Some people talk of the risk of a 6th great extinction. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it by our pressure on the environment. Biodiversity is a crucial component of human well-being. We're clearly harmed if fish stocks dwindle to extinction. There are plants in the rainforest whose gene pool might be useful to us. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness and beauty of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above its value to us as humans. To quote the great ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. As well as rising population, there's a second firm prediction that will aggravate environmental pressures. That's that the world is getting warmer. Climate change will hit hardest those who contributed the least to its cause. Heat stress will most hurt those without air conditioning. Crop failure will most affect those who already struggle to afford food. Extreme weather events will most endanger those whose homes are fragile. Climate change is not under-discussed, but it is under-acted upon. Nearly everyone now accepts the IPCC projections, but there are still divergent views on what the policy response should be. And I think it's important that these differences stem not so much from differences in the science, but in differences about the economics and the ethics. Some economists, like Born-Lomborg's Copenhagen Consensus, they apply the same discounting of the future which you use in deciding whether to, say, finance an office building. And if you do that, then you in effect write off what happens beyond 2050. And you downplay the priority of addressing climate change compared to other nearer-term ways of helping the world's poor. But if you care about those who will live into the 22nd century, as most babies born now certainly will, then you deem it worth paying an insurance premium now to protect those future generations against the risk of crossing climatic tipping points and, for instance, triggering runaway changes like the melting of Greenland's ice. So even those who agree that there's a real risk of climate catastrophe a century hence, they differ in how urgently they advocate action today. Their assessment depends on expectations of future growth and optimism about technological fixes. But above all, it depends on an ethical issue. In optimizing people's life chances, should we discriminate on grounds of date of birth? Incidentally, there's just one policy where an essentially zero discount rate is applied, and that's to radioactive waste disposal, where the depositories are required to prevent leakage for 10,000 years, even 1 million years. And that's a bit ironic because we can't generally plan the rest of our energy policy even 20 or 30 years ahead. Well, many still hope that the world can segue smoothly towards a low-carbon future. But politicians won't gain much resonance by advocating unwelcome lifestyle changes or a high carbon tax, for instance, especially if the benefits are far away and decades in the future. And that's why especially encouraging outcome of the 2015 Paris conference was an initiative called Mission Innovation, where more than 20 nations pledged to double their R&D into all forms of low-carbon energy. And there was a parallel private pledge by Bill Gates and other philanthropists. The target was a modest one. Presently, only 2% of publicly funded R&D is devoted to these challenges. Why shouldn't that go up closer to defense research or even medical research? And the program should include renewables, fourth-generation nuclear, fusion and the rest, and other technologies where parallel progress is crucial: energy storage, batteries and smart grids. This is important because the faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will they become affordable by, for instance, India, where more generating capacity will be needed, where the health of the poorest hundreds of millions is now jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood or dung, and where there will otherwise, if they can't afford renewables, be pressure to build coal-fired power stations. It'd be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean energy systems for the entire world. The faster this is progressed, the sooner India will be able to afford it. Well, what will actually happen on the climate policy front? The pledges made at the Paris conference were a positive step. But even if they're honoured, CO2 concentrations will rise steadily throughout the next 20 years. And by then, we'll know with more confidence from a longer time base of data and from better theoretical modelling just how strong the feedback from water vapour and clouds actually is in amplifying the effect of carbon dioxide itself. This is what's called the climate sensitivity, that when the world gets warmer, you get feedback effects. If this feedback is small, then we relax. But if it's large, and consequently the climate seems on an irreversible trajectory into dangerous territory, there may be pressure for panic measures. This could involve a plan B, being fatalistic about depending on fossil fuels, but combating their effects by a massive investment in carbon capture and storage or by geoengineering. As regards geoengineering, it's feasible to inject enough aerosols into the stratosphere to cool the world's climate, an artificial volcano, as it were. Indeed, what's scary is that this might be within the resources of a single nation, even a single corporation. There could be unintended side effects. Moreover, the warming will return with a vengeance if these countermeasures were stopped. And other consequences of rising carbon dioxide, especially the effect of ocean acidification, would be unchecked. Geoengineering would be a political nightmare. Not all nations would want to adjust the thermostat the same way. Canada and Siberia would be quite happy with a warmer world. And very elaborate climatic modelling would be needed in order to calculate the regional impact of any artificial intervention. In fact, the only beneficiaries would be the lawyers. They'd have a bonanza if nations could litigate over bad weather. Let me now expand on some other concerns I have about the coming decades. Our world increasingly depends on elaborate networks, electric power grids, air traffic control, international finance, globally dispersed manufacturing, and so forth. And unless these networks are highly resilient, their benefits could be outweighed by catastrophic, albeit rare, breakdowns. Real-world analogues of what happened to the financial system in 2008. Our cities will be paralyzed without electricity, supermarket shelves empty within days if supply chains were disrupted. Air travel can spread a pandemic worldwide within days, causing the gravest havoc in the shambolic megacities of the developing world. And social media can spread panic literally at the speed of light. Technology should be our friend. Without applying new science, the world can't provide enough food, better health, and sustainable clean energy for an expanding and more demanding population. But we need not just technology, but wisely directed technology. And geoengineering is an example I would give of not wisely directed technology. And many of us are anxious that some exciting new technologies, especially biotech and robotics, which have potential benefits, are advancing so fast that we may not properly be able to cope with and prevent their downsides. For example, advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing pandemics. But the same research has controversial aspects. For instance, in 2012, two research groups, one in America, one in Holland, showed it was surprisingly easy to make the influenza virus both more virulent and more transmissible. And to some, this was a scary portent of things to come. And in 2014, the American federal government decided to cease funding these so-called gain-of-function experiments. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising. But there are also ethical concerns raised by Chinese experiments on human embryos and by unintended consequences of gene drive programs intended to wipe out parasitic species. Biotech involves small-scale equipment found in lots of university and industrial laboratories. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning as a hobby and competitive game. And I'd worry that even though we want to regulate these technologies to harness the benefits and reduce the risks, whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. I worry that whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. Regulating the huge facilities in the nuclear arena is simple in comparison. And we know all too well that technical expertise doesn't guarantee balanced rationality. The global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have global rage. And the rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals, empowered by bio as well as cyber technology, will, I think, pose a very difficult challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy, and security. Concerns about bioerror and bioterror, I think, are relatively near term, within the next 10 or 15 years. What about looking further ahead to 2050 and beyond? Well, we must then keep our minds open, or at least ajar, to transformative advances that now seem science fiction. After all, today's smartphones and their ancillaries would have seemed magic just 20 years ago. On the bio front, the great physicist Freeman Dyson, for instance, conjectured a time when children will be able to design and create new organisms, just as routinely as his generation played with chemistry sets. Well, if it becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, then our ecology and even our species may not survive long unscathed. And what about another transformative technology? Robotics and artificial intelligence, AI. There's been exciting progress in what's called generalized machine learning. DeepMind, a startup in London, now owned by Google, has achieved a remarkable feat. Its computer beat the world champion in the game of Go, and it did this without being told anything about Go beyond the rules. It just learnt the strategy as well as a human player within a couple of days. Well, of course, it's 20 years since IBM's Deep Blue beat Kasparov, the world chess champion. But Deep Blue was programmed in detail by expert players. And as I said, in contrast, the Go playing machine learnt by itself. And humans didn't understand why it made some moves that turned out to be unusual but especially effective. Computers have the advantage of speed. They use brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of, for example, multilingual European Union documents. They never get bored. And advances in machine learning are patchy. Robots are still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard. They have a hard job tying your shoelaces. But sensor technologies are advancing. And machines won't just take over manual work. Indeed, plumbing and gardening will be among the hardest jobs to automate. But they will take over routine legal work, investment analysis, computer coding, medical diagnostics, say radiology, and even surgery. And they'll prove better than humans at things like managing complex systems, power grids, city traffic, and so forth. And the big question now being debated is, will this new machine age be like earlier disruptive technologies, the car, for instance, and create as many jobs as it destroys? Or is it really different this time? The money earned by the robots could generate fortunes for an elite. But preserving a healthy society will then surely require massive redistribution. So there's money to upgrade public service jobs where the human element is crucial and is now undervalued. In particular, to hugely expand the number of carers for young and old. This is a real challenge. We face this problem now. But let's speculate further ahead. Will robots ever be truly perceived as intelligent beings to which or to whom we can relate, as portrayed in movies like Her and Ex Machina? And if so, will we then have obligations towards them? We worry if our fellow humans and even some animal species can't fulfill their natural potential. So will we someday feel guilty if our robots are underemployed or bored? And what if a machine develops a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? If it could infiltrate the internet and the Internet of Things, it could manipulate the rest of the world. It may have goals utterly impassive to human wishes, or even treat humans as an encumbrance. Well, some AI pundits take such scenarios seriously and think that their field already needs guidelines, just as biotech plainly does. But there are others, like, for instance, Rodney Brooks at Harvard, inventor of the robotic vacuum cleaner, who regard these concerns as premature and worry less about artificial intelligence than about real stupidity. But be that as it may, it's likely, I think, that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether there'll ever be more than idiot savants. There's a far-out futurologist called Ray Kurzweil, who now works at Google, and he's at the opposite end of the spectrum from Brooks. He argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they can themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones, an intelligence explosion, the so-called singularity. He thinks that humans could transcend biology by merging with the machines. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. He thinks this may happen within 25 or 30 years, but he's in his 60s now, and he's worried it may not happen in his lifetime. He takes 100 pills a day, but when he dies, he wants his body frozen in liquid nitrogen by a company in Arizona until this nirvana is reached. And then when immortality is on offer, he can be resurrected or have his brain downloaded. Well, I was surprised to find that 3 academics in England had gone in for this so-called cryonics. 2 had paid the full whack to have their bodies frozen when they die. The 3rd had taken the cut price option of just having his head frozen. I'm glad to say that these 3 were all from Oxford and not from my university. Because I tell these people I'd rather end up in an English churchyard than in a Californian refrigerator. But of course, despite all that, dramatic life extension may happen, along with human enhancement in other forms. And if that does happen, then it'll lead to fundamental forms of inequality if badly handled. So we are going to have to contend with changes where human beings themselves will become malleable in a way they haven't been in human history. But it's beyond our Earth that cyborg and AI technologies will have their most spectacular scope. We last month reached the grand finale of what's surely one of the greatest achievements in space exploration. The Cassini Spacecraft, which has given us a cornucopia of information about Saturn, its rings and its moons, plunged into Saturn. And it carried in its cargo bay a smaller probe called Huygens, built by the European Space Agency, which achieved a soft landing on Saturn's giant moon, Titan, revealing lakes and rivers of liquid methane on that exotic world. Close flybys of a smaller moon, Enceladus, confirmed there was an ocean under the ice, perhaps the most likely location in our solar system for life. It's more than 20 years since Cassini started its journey. So it was built using 1990s technology. And when we realize how spectacularly robotics and smartphones have advanced since then, we realize how amazing Cassini's achievements have been. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by flotillas of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than Cassini, and more advanced also than ESA's Rosetta, which landed on a comet, and NASA's New Horizon, which transmitted amazing pictures back from Pluto, 10,000 times further away than the moon. And later this century, robotic fabricators may build vast, lightweight structures in space, gossamer-thin radio reflectors or solar energy collectors, for instance. These robotic advances will erode the practical case for human spaceflight. Robots can explore the surface of these planets and build big structures. Nonetheless, I hope people will venture into deep space, though it'll be as risk-seeking adventurers rather than for practical goals. And the most promising developments here are spearheaded by private companies. SpaceX, led by Elon Musk, who also makes Tesla cars, hopes soon to offer orbital flights to paying customers. And there's another company, Blue Origin, run by Mr. Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon. And in fact, wealthy adventurers are already signing up, not just to go into low Earth orbit, but to go on a trip round the far side of the moon, going further from Earth than any humans being before. I'm told they've sold a ticket for the second flight, but not the first flight. And maybe that tells you something about the perceived risks. But I think that by the end of the century, thrill seekers in the mold of, for instance, Felix Baumgartner, he was the American who fell supersonically from a high-altitude balloon. People like that, prepared to take high risks, will have established bases independent from the Earth, probably on Mars. And Elon Musk of SpaceX, he's now age 46, and he says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he might make it. But don't ever expect mass emigration from the Earth. And here I disagree strongly with Musk and with my colleague Stephen Hawking, because I think it's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from the Earth's problems. We've got to solve them here, Coping with climate change is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. But we and our terrestrial progeny should, I think, cheer on these brave adventurers who want to become Martians. Because precisely because space is such a hostile environment for humans, these pioneers will have far more incentives than we do on Earth to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyborg technology that we'll develop in coming decades. These techniques will be heavily regulated on Earth, but those on Mars will be far beyond the clutches of the regulators. So it's these spacefarers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead a post-human era, evolving within a few centuries into a new species. Moreover, if post-humans make the transition to fully inorganic intelligence and become sort of electronic brains, then they won't need an atmosphere. And they might prefer zero-G, especially for constructing massive artifacts. So it's in deep space that non-biological brains may undergo continuing evolution, achieving powers that humans can't even imagine. Astronomy reveals that the future of the cosmos is even longer than the past. We've taken 4 billion years to evolve from protozoa, but our sun's got 6 billion more before the fuel runs out. And the expanding universe will continue, perhaps even forever. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So, humans may not even be at the halfway stage of evolution. Well, that's an important thought to think about our place in the scheme of things, but I've got no time to venture further into science fiction, so let me close by focusing back closer to the here and now. The innovations that will drive economic advance, information technology, biotech and nanotech, they can boost the developing as well as the developed world. Indeed, we need to push these forwards. If we don't responsibly progress them, we'll forego disproportionate benefits. We mustn't take the precautionary principle too far. But I've argued that there is a downside. We fret unduly about small risks. Air crashes, carcinogens in food, low radiation doses, etc. But we're in denial about newly emergent threats, which could be devastating. Some of these could be environmental tipping points. Others could stem from the potential misuse of novel technologies, as I've mentioned. And that's why, incidentally, some of us in Cambridge have set up a centre to try and study these extreme risks, these low probability, high consequence threats which might confront us. We want to consider how to enhance resilience against the more credible ones and to warn against developments that could run out of control. And these risks are understudied, so I think that even if we can reduce them by only a tiny percentage, the stakes are so high that we learn our keep. A wise mantra is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. These are unfamiliar, but they may become seriously probable. How can we, as scientists and specialists, engage with politicians? Their focus is on the urgent and parochial and getting re-elected. The issues that attract their attention are those that get headlined in the media and fill their inboxes. How do we get them to care about these long-term questions? Well, I know people who've been scientific advisors to politicians. They get depressed. They don't have much traction. The politicians have their immediate concerns. But I think we can have more effect by campaigning so that the public and the media amplify our voice. We can engage by involvement with NGOs, blogging and journalism, or through political activities. Science is universal culture, spanning all nations and all faiths. And the scientists can confront fewer impediments in straddling political divides. And I think the world's religions have a role too. I'm on the council of the Papal Academy of Sciences, which is itself an ecumenical body whose members represent all faiths and none. 2 years ago, my economist colleague Partha Dasgupta, along with Ram Ramanathan, a climate scientist, these are two lapsed Hindus, they organized a high-level scientific conference on climate and environment at the Vatican, attended by the world's best climate scientists and economists like Stiglitz and Jeffrey Sachs. And this provided a scientific groundwork for the papal encyclical a year later, which was therefore grounded on good science. And that encyclical, of course, had huge traction. The Pope got a standing ovation at the UN, and it had great traction in Latin America, in Africa, East Asia, not, I think, in the American Republican Party, which is rather a pity. Because there's no gainsaying the Catholic Church's global reach, nor its long-term perspective, nor its concern for the world's poor. And the encyclical, incidentally, emphasized also our responsibility to the developing world and to future generations. And as I said, it had substantial and timely influence all across the world. We need to promote longer-term thinking. And on this point, I'd like to conclude with a sort of homily, something which strikes me whenever I look at one of Europe's great cathedrals, particularly the one in Ely, which is about 10 miles from where I live in England. Those who built Ely Cathedral and all the European great cathedrals, they thought the world might only last another 1,000 years, and they knew of nothing beyond Europe. But despite those restricted horizons, in both time and space, despite the deprivation and harshness of their lives, despite the primitive technology and meager resources, they built these huge and glorious buildings, which they never lived to see finished, and which uplift our spirits centuries later. What a contrast that is to so much of our discussion today. Unlike our forebears, we know a great deal about our world, and indeed about what lies beyond. Technologies that our ancestors couldn't have conceived enrich our lives and our understanding. Many phenomena make us fearful, but the advance of science spares us from irrational dread. We know that we are stewards of a precious pale blue dot in a vast cosmos, a planet with a future measured in billions of years. So isn't it shameful that our planning horizon is shorter than that of our medieval forebears? Spaceship Earth is hurtling through space. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning, too little awareness of long-term risks. This pale blue dot in the cosmos is a special place. It may be a unique place, and we're its stewards at a especially crucial era. And that's, I think, an important message for us all, whether we're astronomers or not. Thank you very much for listening.